Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Table Talks, a conversation on race. It's great to be with everybody on this beautiful Wednesday afternoon. I'm at the University of Central Florida recording today's episode, and today is March 8th, 2023. My name is Erwin Lopez, and I am the co-chair of the Beloved Community, which works alongside the Bishop's Anti-Racist Task Force. And it's really an honor to lead these Table Talks. And I've been learning so much through them, and I hope you have too. And I hope that you are sharing this with your congregation and that this is equipping your work of anti-racism. I would like to share with you our mission. Our mission and our goal is to bring awareness to anti-racism, to the work of anti-racism in the Florida Conference, to equip and support those who are integrating anti-racism into their lives. And we believe that anti-racism is an act of discipleship. So this is how we love God and how we love neighbor. As for today's topic, we're going to be talking about striving for equity in pastoral salaries. This is part one of two conversations. And today our guest is Dr. David Eagle, who's the Assistant Research Professor of Global Health at Duke University. He's a sociologist who studies the social and structural determinants of mental and physical health. His content expertise is in society and religion, including the changing role of religion in North American society and the role of race in religious structures. His methods expertise is in the collection and analysis of survey data. He holds a PhD from Duke University, a Master of Theology from Duke Divinity School, and a Master of Divinity from Fresno Pacific University, and a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering. Mechanical Engineering, look at that. Whoa, that was random. That came out of nowhere. Well, great. From the University of Alberta. He's also a leading researcher in what we'll be discussing today mainly in a 12-year study titled Reproducing Inequality in a Formerly Anti-Racist Organization, the Case of Racialized Career Pathways in the United Methodist Church. And so thank you so much, Dr. Eagle, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you, and we're excited to hear about your research findings, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Erwin, for that kind introduction. And it's such a pleasure to be with you, and I appreciate you coming to hear me present on this research, racialized career paths for clergy in the United Methodist Church. I want to just tell you a little bit of a story about how this research came to be. Back in 2010, the Duke Clergy Health Initiative, of which I am a part, was doing focus groups with pastors to talk to them about the barriers they experience to maintaining good health. And so we convened a special group of Black pastors in the UMC to talk about their experiences. What barriers did they experience to maintaining good health? But in this group, nobody actually wanted to talk about health. Everyone wanted to talk about how they felt their race limited their career paths and earning potentials. This spawned what has become a very long-term research project where we really took and are taking a deep dive into racial pay disparities among United Methodist clergy in North and South Carolina, which ultimately led to an academic paper that was published last year in the American Journal of Sociology, a report to cabinets on pay disparities, and continued research and advocacy with BIPOC clergy, with cabinets, bishops to press for changes to improve working conditions. In this talk, I'm going to talk about racism, but I want to be clear about how I am going to use that term because it's used in different ways. The way I talk about and think about racism is this way, that racism, it's a social process through which social and material resources are distributed unequally to people. And the unequal distribution of those goods and resources are distributed according to a racial group's relative social position. So in other words, racial prejudice is a system of control that directs more resources to higher status racial groups and fewer resources to lower status groups. And as a social process, racism becomes rooted in our organizations and structures. And once these organizations get built, social structures change very slowly, which is why racial disparities are so incredibly hard to tackle and make movement on. And so today I want to talk briefly about the ways in which racism has become institutionalized within the United Methodist Church. So how does racism structure outcomes for pastors in the United Methodist Church? Well, if you look at the career paths of clergy in the UMC, you will find that among clergy of similar levels of qualification and responsibility, there exist considerable disparities in earning, perceptions of the work environment, and opportunities for advancement based on race. In terms of the data that I draw upon for this study and for these studies that we've done in this area, I don't want to go into tons of depth, but I want to give you just a sense of some of the places that we're drawing from. We're triangulating data from a number of sources, both quantitative and qualitative data sources. We have conducted focus groups with Black UMC pastors in North Carolina. We've also done in-depth interviews with district superintendents in both conferences in North Carolina and the South Carolina conference. The denomination, as you probably know, collects annual statistics from each of its churches that contain information on the racial composition of churches, size of churches, that sort of thing. And then we at the Duke Clergy Health Initiative have been running a long-term study of United Methodist clergy in the state that goes all the way back to 2008 and continues to this day. And then we also are using some web scrape data to get information on pastors in South Carolina. As most of you probably know, the United Methodist Church is made up mostly of white members and white clergy. These are the annual statistics. They might be a little bit out of date, which you can see on this slide. However, owing to the vagaries of history, there's actually considerable regional variation in the proportion of minority clergy in different annual conferences. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on the three annual conferences on three annual conferences of the UMC: the North Carolina Annual Conference, the Western North Carolina Annual Conference, and the South Carolina Annual Conference. These are national statistics. You can see that clergy are almost 90% white and about 6% Black. And the North Carolina conferences, both of them, about mirror the national statistics. However, in South Carolina, again, due to some historical factors, about 26% of clergy in South Carolina are Black. And I guess I should also say on this that we are focusing on the experiences of Black clergy, mostly because, at least in North Carolina, they make up the largest group of non-white clergy. However, we think that these experiences extend to other racialized groups in the United Methodist Church as well. When talking about racial disparities in the United Methodist Church, especially amongst clergy, you really can't not talk about the concept of open itineracy. And quoting the Book of Discipline, open itineracy is defined as this: that appointments are made without regard to race, ethnic origin, gender, color, disability, marital status, or age, and that annual conferences shall emphasize the open nature of itineracy and prepare congregations to receive the gifts and graces of appointed clergy without regard to race, ethnic origin, gender, color, disability, marital status, or age. So this is the official policy of the United Methodist Church. However, I will show you that this policy is rarely followed. Appointments in the United Methodist Church are very much made with racial considerations. In United Methodist Church congregations in the Carolinas, churches are extraordinarily homogeneous. About 2% of congregations, this is back in 2014, so these data have changed a little bit. About 2% of United Methodist congregations in both North and South Carolina would be considered multiracial, meaning that less than 90% of the members are of the same racial category. The vast majority of UMC congregations in the Carolinas are pretty much monoracial. Again, the statistic is from a while ago, 2014, 2015, so things are somewhat different today, although not radically different. These data, of course, are reported by the congregation, so they're not perfect representations of the racial makeup of congregations, but this really doesn't change the fact that there's little racial diversity within individual United Methodist congregations in the Carolinas. And so it's within this context of mostly monoracial churches that district superintendents are asked to apply this principle of open itineracy. So what happens in a situation where district superintendents are asked to appoint pastors to churches without regard to race? Well, in short, this figure shows, open itineracy is basically ignored, and white pastors are appointed to white churches and black pastors to black churches. This slide shows the correspondence between the racial identity of the senior pastor or solo pastor and the racial makeup of the congregation. As you can see in this chart, in North Carolina in 2014, 96.4% of predominantly white churches were led by white pastors, and 89.8% of black churches were led by black pastors. The story in South Carolina is exactly the same, even though South Carolina has far more black clergy. 99.4% of white churches had white pastors. Again, this is talking about senior and solo pastors, and 100% of black churches had black pastors. So it's obvious from this that race is being considered when pastors are being appointed to churches. DSs are not applying the concept of open itineracy as it's recorded in the Book of Discipline. You can run some very simple simulations to determine, what would the racial correspondence between pastors and churches look like if race wasn't being considered? That is, if open itineracy were being practiced as it is envisioned. What would the situation, say, look like in South Carolina if race was not being a consideration when appointments were being made? Well, it would look like this: 3/4 of white churches would be led by white pastors, and 3/4 of black churches would be led by black pastors. 1/4 of white churches would have black pastors, and 1/4 of black churches would have black pastors. But clearly, this is not the reality. Pastors are being matched to their congregations by race. So how does this happen? What's going on here? How does the UMC, how does the annual conference, how do district superintendents and cabinets, how is the decision-making process such that open itineracy is not leading to a more even distribution of pastors by race, but rather is matching pastors to the race of their congregation? Well, the challenge of open itineracy, at least the challenge that district superintendents face, I think is summed up very well by this one white district superintendent from South Carolina who said very succinctly, open itineracy looks great on paper. So in other words, while open itineracy is the official policy of the church, district superintendents perceive open itineracy as impossible to implement. Time and time again, as we have talked to DSs, they pointed out that anti-Black racist ideologies prevalent in many white churches are the reason behind which they cannot implement open itineracy. So in the words of one district superintendent said, well, do you do that move? That is, do you move that pastor when the folks where you're obviously trying to move a pastor into look you in the eye and say, you can't send that pastor here, but we're not coming. Or you can send that pastor here, but we're not coming. We'll go to the Baptist street down the street. Or another DS in South Carolina said, and so I do still have the struggle, especially in rural areas of South Carolina, where most of the churches I serve are Anglo, white, I assume in this context, and conservative. I still have the challenge of trying to get them to be open to an African-American, and to my disappointment, they're not willing to have them. District superintendents, when we've talked to them, are also quick to point out that a concern for the well-being of the pastor is also part of the reason that makes them reluctant to appoint cross-racially. One white district superintendent put it this way: I wouldn't say that it was just yielding to the congregation's preference. It came down to a concern for the pastor and the pastor's family as well. Another said, each annual conference would say that appointments are not made on the basis of race or gender or anything like that. But the other part of it is a bishop and a chairman would not want to send an African-American pastor to a racist church because that would destroy the ministry of that pastor. And concerns for the well-being of the pastor were very commonplace. District superintendents felt that on balance, cross-racial appointments carried too much risk. The risk that large number of people would leave the church if they appointed a Black pastor, and also the risk that Black pastors would be harmed by the racist environment of many white, especially rural churches. So to put it bluntly, district superintendents justify segregation on the basis that it would harm both employees and the clientele and congregations they serve. And of course, these are perfectly reasonable assumptions. In the South, with its long legacy of racial tension, DSs feel they have to consider race in appointment decisions. They recognize that this all goes against official policy, but they just can't see how they can make appointments without considering race. The unfortunate thing is that these actions of district superintendents have significant consequences for who gets the rewards and benefits from the organization. Salary differences are one of the easiest way to index the level of inequality and the way in which the decision to appoint Black pastors to only Black churches and vice versa, the way that this is manifest in real data, in hard data. In North Carolina, if you only compare solo and lead pastor salaries, you will see that there is about a $6,000 gap in salaries between annual salaries between solo and lead pastors. In South Carolina, the gap is smaller, but again, it's still considerable at $4,000 a year. And this is accounting for differences in levels of experience, education, et cetera. So this is keeping those things constant, but these disparities still exist. You can look at salary disparities amongst clergy in another way. You can look at the percentage of clergy earning more than $75,000 per year, which might be considered a sort of minimum sort of standard of to maintain a relatively modest standard of living in the Carolinas as a family. This is about what you need to make. So in North Carolina, 12% of white clergy earned this amount. In South Carolina, about 13% of clergy maintain this level. This compares to 3% of Black clergy earning more than at least $75,000 a year, and 4% in South Carolina. So again, huge racial disparities here. Black pastors are intimately aware that their white counterparts are typically out earning them. As one pastor remarked to us in a focus group, I've not quite understood why we have certain people on one salary, our white counterparts at one salary, and yet we're all the United Methodist Church and we're on a lower salary because it's only what a church can afford to pay. And at some point, we're going to have to address that, because as a pastor in full connection, we should all make the same thing, and it shouldn't be the difference that we experience. And it does cause angriness. It does cause stress, because my family of four wants to eat just like anybody else's family of four. These salary disparities exist because larger United Methodist churches are, for the most part, white. And both because of economies of scale and because larger churches tend to be more affluent, larger churches can pay larger salaries. The two churches, and in our interviews with DSs, they readily acknowledge that matching clergy and congregations by race systematically disadvantaged Black pastors. After acknowledging the role that racial disparities exist in pay and then asked to explain why these gaps exist, district superintendents often noted this role of church size. As one district superintendent put it, for the most part, it's very large churches that pay very large salaries. The very large churches in our conferences tend to be whiter. This leads to racial disparities because, in the words of another district superintendent, because large churches tend to be white, pastors of color are not being afforded opportunities to serve in some larger churches. In addition, two district superintendents stated that white churches typically have larger budgets from which to pay their pastors than Black churches. This, coupled with, as one district superintendent put it, the hesitancy to make cross-racial appointments, created a smaller pool of possibilities for people of color. The disparities that Black pastors experience because of race matching are not only economic, they're also social and psychological. Take the issue of social support. Black clergy look to other Black clergy for social support. Support from other Black clergy is particularly important as they navigate a majority white denomination. But because of pervasive race matching, combined with there being relatively few well-paying, predominantly Black churches, Black clergy face a complicated relationship with their peers. Not only does race matching in the appointment process significantly limit the occupational mobility of pastors, it creates fierce competition for the few higher-paying, more prestigious appointments. Black pastors grappled with the fear that they might become too close to that if they became too close to their colleagues, they might give away a vital piece of information that might help their colleague secure a better appointment at their expense. This fear is greater for Black pastors because of the increased competition for the very small number of coveted positions. One Black pastor said they're waiting on me in a larger Black church, said they're waiting on me to die or retire so that people can move up and be promoted. And as long as I stay here, this desirable Black church appointment, my sisters and brothers can't move up. Still, another put the situation that they experience as a Black clergy person in the United Methodist Church this way. The trust isn't there. We just don't trust one another. Now, it's easy to judge the actions of district superintendents and bishops harshly. Why don't they faithfully implement the policy of open itinerancy and hopefully give Black pastors a more level playing field on which to compete for the organization's rewards and benefits? But the problem is not so much a failure of individual decision makers in the organization. District superintendents, bishops, cabinets, they're constrained in the kinds of decisions they make. They're being forced to make really, really difficult decisions. Rather, the failure, I think, is at a larger organizational level, that there's a failure to create systemic changes that could challenge the deep-seated nature of racism within the organization, how race is structuring outcomes in really consequential ways for pastors. And the organization has failed to take a deep look at how things could be changed to encourage greater equity and equality. So to close, what has our research suggested we do to move this path forward? Well, I think we have we feel there's two policy solutions that we think would make a significant would present a significant opportunity to help improve this situation. We offer these suggestions always understanding that the situation is complex, and that many clergy people across the UMC are already making efforts. Annual conferences, of course, are working hard to address disparities, and that there's a ton of work and complicated work that would need to be done to generate solutions based on some of our recommendations. And really, we make these suggestions out of a desire to move beyond just studying and researching the problem. I think partly as a researcher, I can get trapped in that and really want to move forward conversations that might help improve the situation on the ground. And again, with the caveat that these suggestions are potentially challenging to implement, we think the following ideas are important to bring into conversations about how to improve equity amongst clergy pay across the United Methodist Church. Firstly, that apportionments ought to be leveraged as a redistributed mechanism to help ensure racial pay equity across congregations. There's already a process in place by which congregations can share resources with one another. And that because of that, that would also then enable the establishment of a common salary scale that's based on factors like job performance and years of experience, rather than simply leaving salaries solely up to the discretion of individual congregations. I think that the relationship between size and pay needs to be broken, in other words. And if you look broadly at the broad literature on how organizations can reduce salary inequities, research on both public and nonprofit, in both the public and nonprofit sector, has found that worker morale actually goes up when salaries are centrally established by clear and transparent formulae. They aren't really in congregations today. In addition, researchers have noted how nonprofit employees are happiest in environments where people with the same level of experience and training are compensated similarly, and when the overall wage differences between employees in the organization are minimized. Many of the people that we have talked to about our research have rightly pointed out that reducing the prevalence of race matching in the appointment process might also improve racial inequities in pay. And while this might reduce inequities, it doesn't really address the deeper problem where smaller and more resource-constrained congregations are excluded from receiving more experienced pastors. A common salary scale allows Black pastors the freedom to serve Black churches without worrying about whether they will face a financial penalty for doing so. So thanks for your time and attention, and I look forward to some conversation. I'll sharing my screen if I can find my mouse.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Eagle. I have some questions for you, but if anybody wants to ask any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A, and we'll be happy to answer them as best as we can. For me, one of the first questions that I have is, as a member of the Board of Ordained Ministry, and even as a young clergy of color, we are encouraged to recruit clergy of color. And findings like this, for me, makes me question, what are we recruiting them into? I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yes, I think that is it's definitely true that there is, and rightly so, a lot of advocacy for trying to get more clergy from minoritized community in the UMC, and that's definitely a noble goal. And you're equally right that the system that they are entering into is one that is fraught with deep inequalities, and one where, as a person of color, you are likely to experience penalties, both in terms of how much you're paid, the kinds of opportunities to advance through the organization that you might be afforded. In other research, we have found that pastors of color experience the ordination process very differently from white candidates, that there is a whole lot of additional scrutiny that's played to pastors of color as they go through ordination, and it can be a very difficult experience, whereas for many white pastors, it's a much smoother, easier process. So yeah, there is this conflicting situation where you want more diversity amongst your clergy staff, but you are reluctant to recommend them to join the organization because of the barriers they might address, which again, I think pushes to the need for improving the work environment, and for how things like pay and salary are determined, that those are critical factors to address if the United Methodist Church does want to attract and retain more clergy of color.
I appreciate that response. And as you can see, somebody who's, trying to diversify our church, it's definitely a question that I've been asking myself. Another question that I have is that you mentioned that there were a couple of annual conferences who have been making some progress in changing some of these systems. Can you give us some examples of annual conferences and some of the changes they've been making? I know that here in the Florida conference, and you've mentioned this in one of your research findings, and how Bishop Carter said that there's been about $14 million spent on equitable compensation in the past decade here in the Florida conference. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more, not just about the Florida conference, but other annual conferences that have been making some progress.
So I think I think Florida is definitely a leader in this realm with equitable compensation. Strategies are definitely a step in the right direction. Unfortunately, I don't have a ton of examples that I can point to of conferences that are trying this in serious ways. At least when I have discussed the idea of, say, establishing a common salary scale on which pastors are paid, most leaders in the United Methodist Church are highly skeptical of that idea as being workable, and it often gets dismissed. So I think that on those levels, I think there hasn't been a lot of uptake in those ideas, although I still think that model, a more reparations-based model, makes a lot of sense. I can say that definitely in both annual conferences of the United Methodist Church in North Carolina, there is definitely a lot of effort being placed on both creating resources, workshops, trainings for congregations as they receive pastors of different minority with different from different racialized communities, and so helping congregations understand how they can be safe environments and be environments where clergy that might be different from them racially can thrive. So I think those definitely are also steps in the right direction to make it more, to make DSs feel more comfortable making cross-racial appointments can definitely, I think, also improve. And we've seen more, I think we've seen more movement in that direction than we have on the direction of creating common salaries to pay pastors.
I'm wondering, we have a question coming in here. Let me read Erin's question here. Erin Lane, she says, curious if you know, how do racial disparities among North Carolina, South Carolina UMC clergy compare to disparities in other denominations or in other professions? i.e., is it particularly bad to be a non-white UMC clergy?
So yeah, that is a great question. We don't really know how this compares to clergy in other denominations. There's been very little research done at this level, and it's also difficult to this is difficult data to gather because you need data on individual pastors' salaries, race, gender, and then also on the racial makeup of congregations. So there are some difficulties in doing that. Other denominations, of course, have different hiring practices as well. So there's a different mechanism at play in that. In many denominations that don't operate through an appointment system, pastors are applying directly to congregations, and congregations are hiring them. The same disparities exist, but the solutions are more difficult because there often isn't an easy mechanism through which congregations can share financial resources with one another, making those difficult to tackle. In terms of the mechanism which we observe here, that Black clergy are being matched to Black congregations, and due to deep racial disparities that exist within the United States, that Black clientele or Black organizations have fewer resources from which to pay their staff. We definitely see that as well. It's been well documented in medicine that when Black doctors serve predominantly Black communities, they are paid less and have less opportunity to advance in their careers. And the same has been observed with Black lawyers as well, who serve Black clientele. Some Black clergy, some Black lawyers, even within majority white law firms, they're often appointed other Black clientele to serve, and often those clientele don't have the same resources. So we see similar mechanisms at play in other organizations as well.
I love reading your research. You have this one particular quote in the very beginning where it says, in an increasingly diverse America, understanding how race operates in the few remaining racially homogeneous outposts of privilege is essential to the project of dismantling its power. And I love this aspect that you brought, where you were basically looking to see if the same inequity that we see in corporations, and like you mentioned, even in the medical field, were present in an organization that is striving to be anti-racist, and how you found comparisons and similarities. And so I appreciate the idea of, like, if we want to be anti-racist, we're going to have to also study these inequities in salaries and the way that we operate that. So I appreciate that response.
And that's, for me, I think, too often when we're thinking about anti-racist efforts, our minds go straight to ways to reduce racial prejudice. And of course, reducing racial prejudice is an admirable goal and an important aim. However, racism doesn't need racially prejudiced attitudes to continue to disadvantage racialized communities, and that there are rules and processes and the ways our organizations work that have become deeply ingrained in just the way organizations work, that can continue to perpetuate major inequities. without any individual within the organization needing to be particularly prejudiced against a particular group. So I think what I'm really trying to push with my research is that we also need to really look deep inside, not only our own selves and in how we think and talk to each other and reducing prejudice, but also within our organizations and looking at the subtle ways that the rules and the structures that we have created were created within a highly segregated, highly unequal context and are often serve to perpetuate that. So finding ways to change our organization and the organizations, the way our organizations work to produce more equitable outcomes, I think is really, really critical.
I appreciate that. And we have a couple questions here I want to address. Carla Evers has a question. You might have addressed this, so I apologize. Are Black women clergy salaries less than white women clergy?
So one challenge we have in terms of looking at the salary disparities between women of color and white women is that we have in North Carolina, at least where we have most of our data from, is that we have very few clergy of color to begin with. And then when you split them further by women, it gets even smaller. So it's difficult to make comparisons between white women clergy and Black women clergy. In terms of gender disparities, we have found that there still are gender gaps between what women and men pastors are paid. That gap is mostly exists because of historical differences between what men and women are paid, and that if you look at people starting in, say, the last 10 years, we're not seeing the same gaps in clergy who are starting now, but the gaps persist because in 30 years ago, women and men were compensated very differently. So we still see those differences persist. I can't speak exactly to the point of whether white women and Black women are paid differently.
We have a comment from Elsa, wondering if you can share your thoughts on them. It seems to me that diversity in general is not likely. If pastors are to be assigned based on what the congregation makeup is, it seems like racial divide is being promoted because the conference is focused on maintaining numbers. We have a Black pastor in a white church. There are a lot of issues, but it's getting better.
Yes. So I will say that there are lots of complicated questions that come up when you think about multiracial congregations and the possibility of and the challenges that cross-racial appointments bring. I think in general, encouraging more cross-racial appointments is a good thing if congregations, if annual conferences are willing to have the difficult conversations about how to make that work in practice. There's another issue I think that comes into play, in that for many Black churches, there is a concern that there is a concern that appointing a white pastor to lead a predominantly Black congregation that also brings some problematic questions, in that should not Black members and Black organizations be allowed to determine their future, and why should a white person be put in charge of a historically Black congregation, given the ability to lead those congregations. So we definitely do hear Black clergy who really do want to preserve the historically Black United Methodist congregations, and feel that they would, if given the opportunity to be equitably compensated, would really value the opportunity to do so. But the situation is, it's difficult for them to continue in those roles because the churches are small and don't pay the same way. So there's a lot of complicated issues that come into play here.
I have a couple more questions for you, unless somebody has another question. But in these calls, most of the people who listen to them are either laity or clergy. And so my question is, what can we do? what can the laity do? What can the clergy do? Do we write a resolution? Do we write to the cabinet to have you come in and do a consultation with them? Like, what are some next steps that we can take as a laity and clergy?
So I think that there needs to be more grassroots movement for establishing salary scales that aren't purely dependent on the size of congregations. And it not only touches issues of race, it touches issues of urban, rural divides. Rural churches can often not pay as much as urban churches. It touches on a lot of issues. And it comes to this deeper question of why do we think that a church of 1,000 is more difficult to pastor than a church of 100? And why do we value, and why is size the metric of a pastor's effectiveness? And so I think there's a really important conversation to be had of why do we link mostly congregation size and congregational resources to how much a pastor is compensated, when we know that pastoral ministry is, it's a difficult occupation no matter how big the church is, and the skills to lead a small church are equally as important and valuable as the skills to lead a larger church. So I think definitely advocacy from clergy and laity to the leadership of their annual conferences to really get this conversation to be front and center, I think is really important. Our experience is most cabinets are just not, they're just not even thinking about this as an important issue. And I think first raising awareness is we're still at that level of raising awareness and thinking about equity in a much more holistic way. And I think there's a really unique opportunity that the church could have and churches could have in saying, most of the world assigns people salary and rewards people their salaries based on, how large the organization is and how much money they make and how much money the organization makes, et cetera, how many people attend the organization. But, in the sort of finances of the kingdom, is that really the way it works, or is ought to work? Or is it the biblical vision behind how we compensate people? And I think the church has a really unique opportunity to say, no, it's not. This isn't it's not the biggest and the largest that should get rewarded the most. Everyone has equal value and equal dignity in the kinds of work they're doing, whether it's in a small church, a church that's struggling, or in a church that's large and growing. That these places, that those shouldn't be the metrics by which we reward pastors financially. We should value all work more equally. And so I think, advocating, writing resolutions, keeping these issues before cabinets, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, I got 2 more questions for you, and then we'll let you get on with the rest of your work. And we want to thank you so much for your time. You mentioned this, and this is a thought that I've had for a while. You mentioned this when in your presentation. You said something to the equivalent of the relationship needs to be broken, or something like that. And for me, when I think about a clergy person in a cross-racial appointment and the inability of the congregation to receive that pastor because the church will decline. Well, what we're really saying is that the church may diversify. The church may change into something that it should have been in the beginning. And so how much needs to be broken before we can build again?
It's a very good question. So I have a colleague who teaches at University of Cincinnati. His name is Onea Okuwobi, who has thought very deeply on the issue of multiracial congregations. And in her opinion, you do have to, in order to have a truly multiracial congregation that's operating effectively and that is truly equitable, you do have to tear things down to sort of the foundation and rebuild, because it is very hard to retrofit a white congregation to be multi-ethnic, multiracial, and that really you do have to start from the ground up. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there. But
how do we calm the anxieties of money, right? Because money's got to be the driving force there. Like, we can't lose this church because of the money that it brings. So we just trust God through it all? Like, what's right?
So I think there's so I think, yes, definitely there has to be trust in the process. There has to be creativity at the conference level to build, to be willing to create the structures, to create the resources for congregations to be able, that are wanting to make a transition, to become more multi-ethnic, multiracial, to make those transitions without worrying that any major change you make might sort of taint the financial viability of the congregation. I think those resources need to be provided. So that's about all I can say on that issue. And that, I think the issue of how to create congregations that are truly cooperative across racial and other divides is getting outside of my own area of expertise. But I would definitely recommend friends like Onea as people who really thought deeply about this and have ideas about how you could actually implement this in practice.
What's his name again? Can you spell it for
This
us?
is yes.
Maybe put it in the chat, or
I put this in the chat. So this is
as you write that, I want to just ask one last question, and that is, for those of us who are allies, because I know that some of your research also focuses on the disparity between women and men. So for women in the system, for clergy in the system of color, what kind of word of hope do you have for us as we continue to navigate these waters, these processes?
So my, this is going to sound trite. My hope is in God, that, and I don't mean that in a trite way, but as someone who's always, struggled with the church and struggled with churches and been frustrated about how slow progress often is in the church and in churches, I am surprised from time to time that the Holy Spirit does actually show up in meaningful ways, and that there often are really unexpected and creative expressions of God's work of reconciliation that appear in congregations in the midst of the messiness and the brokenness and the ways that churches sort of go against their ultimate goals or their stated goals and aims. I'm still surprised that God does show up, and that as people continue to listen faithfully to God, faithfully to each other, faithfully listen to what's going on in the world around them, that creative expressions and small movements do occur. And it's in those small movements and small places that bigger things grow. I think that's a deeply biblical idea. So I have hope, even though most days, if you asked if I had hope, I might say I don't. So that's my word, well, as much to myself as it is to others who struggle to lead and serve congregations and stay in community with people who are different than them.
Well, I appreciate your time, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness, and I hope that this message inspires all of us to implement some change. And we had a talk last week, and one of the persons says, we need more disruptive leadership. We need more disruptive leadership. And so I hope this leads to responsible disruptive leadership, so that we can encourage our cabinet, our appointive system, our denomination to just think about some of these things and how we can improve our system. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Aaron.
Thank you for everybody who joined us today. This ends our table talk. We will follow up with an email highlighting some of what Dr. Eagle said, and also offering you extra resources. And we look forward to part 2 of this conversation with one of Dr. Eagle's colleagues on this research, Dr. Colin Mueller, professor of sociology. So thank you so much again, and we'll see you all on our next table talk. And Dr. Eagle, thank you again for your time.
All right, peace.
Bye, peace.